In this tutorial, we're going to use a thing called the UV Texture Editor to generate this cube with the Photoshop file that appears on it. Till now, we've been using planar maps with one surface, one flat surface, either X, Y, or Z. This has a texture on all of those planes. Now, we're going to be using the UV Texture Editor to export essentially a UV map that Photoshop will understand and where we can put our textures to apply them to our cube. So we have identical geometry here, one that is just a simple cube, the other that's already completed. I'm going to add the UV Texture Editor to my shelf. I'm holding Command and Shift. I'm going to go to UV Editor. You'll see on your shelf now a checkerboard pattern with a green background. And when I click on that, with the geometry selected with my cube, I can now preview that art as it appears on this UV map. Now I'm going to zoom in on this, and I'm using the same selection tools or the same zoom tools that we use for our viewport. We can use our option key, our right and center button to manipulate that viewport. I'm going to zoom back a little bit on this again because you'll notice that this is broken up into 4 panels. Any texture that's going to appear on geometry has to be in the right-hand corner of this editor. And this all makes sense once we actually start to export and build our texture in Photoshop. So let's delete this, and now let's get started. I'm going to select my geometry, and the first thing I want to do is put a node on this. Right now you can see we've got the default Lambert one, which we would never change or add a texture to. I'm going to right click, choose Assign New Material. I'll use a Lambert again. I'm going to name this Crate. And I'm going to use that Color tab. And I'm going to go to the end of that tab as we've been doing to introduce textures, and I'm going to click on that. But before I go out and find a file to put my geometry, inside the render node, you'll see at the very top it says checker. And I'm going to click on that texture, click on checkerboard. And if you hit 6 on the keyboard, you'll see that checkerboard pattern distributed evenly on your cube. Now let's bring up the UV Texture Editor and take a look at what this looks like. So I'll click on that little green icon. And I want to make sure my geometry is selected before anything appears in that upper right-hand corner. Now, it's hard to see the UV map. That is a skin with 6 cubes on, or 6 squares where the textures will go. So inside my View UV Editor, you'll notice that right up in here, there's a little graphic that has 2 mountain peaks and a sun peeking through. I'm going to click on that, and it turns off that texture momentarily so I can see the shape of this UV map. So you can see it's opened that shape up into these flat squares. We'll be exporting these flat squares into Photoshop, where we'll be able to place our texture in each of these panels. I'm going to make sure that my geometry is selected, and I'll know that because I'll see that the white line shows up, this grid or this UV map shows up in the UV editor. If I were in my editing mode, it would show up, but I would not be able to export this as a Photoshop network. So be sure that you're in your object mode, and then we would go to Image, create PSD network. And in the PSD network, we want to name and direct that. So I'm going to click on the folder, and I'll give it a name for file name. And the punctuation would have to be an underscore. And I'll hit Save. Now, usually the default size is set for 1024 by 1024. You'll notice that the aspect ratio is checked with an object or a map, UV map that will be square. That represents this corner in the UV map. Now, the color node will have our texture. I'm going to click on color node down here, and then I'm going to click on this little right arrow to put in the select attributes column. I've got it directed, I have the size. Something smaller this will be grainy, something larger than that might be a little too big as far as resolution goes. So this is a good place to start off with. I'll now click on Apply. Now two things will happen. Your geometry will be deselected and your UV map will disappear over on the right hand side, letting us know that we were successful in generating that Photoshop network that we'll be able to open in Photoshop and apply our texture to. Now we're in Photoshop, so I'm going to go to File, Open, and I'm going to open up that Create Skin PSD. And you'll see that that checkerboard pattern came in with it as well. And if we were to take a look at our layer window, put them side by side, our layer window and our file window, you'll notice the checkerboard pattern appears in the layer window inside of a folder. Anything inside that folder will show up as a texture in Maya. Anything outside of it will not appear on your geometry. So we want to be very careful that our texture does go into that folder. Now we don't need a checkerboard pattern at this point, so I'm simply going to fill this in as a solid black. And now you'll see that UV snapshot that is represented here is on its own separate layer. Our next goal is to put our textures into these positions. I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to go to Open, and I'll go to my folder, and I've got a PNG that will be in a zip file for you to use. And my objective now is to copy and paste these panels into these UV squares. We're almost done generating our texture map. The last thing I want to do though is to safeguard the seams where some black might show through by this default. I'm going to click on that. I'm going to get my eyedropper tool. I'm going to sample brown from my file and I'm going to fill that layer black in with that brown. And I'm going to turn off the UV snapshot and I'm going to hit Command S to save. Now, if I've finished generating my texture and I do save in Photoshop, I can return to Maya and I'll select my cube. I'll go out to my texture folder and you'll notice that it might update as soon as you do that. Always click on the reload button though. Very often you'll see it on screen and then you go to render it and there's no texture because the screen might be reflecting it, but Maya's render engine may not see that texture at all. Let's go ahead and we'll get our final gather. I'm going to click on it and there's my crepe. If your texture hasn't shown up on your geometry, there's a couple of things you can do to make sure that everything is in place. First of all, select your geometry and then hit 6 on the keyboard. If you still don't see it, with your geometry selected, click on your texture editor. Problem might be that inside the UV texture editor, you're going to see a little icon with 2 little mountain peaks and a planet above it. When I click on that, it allows me to preview the texture or just the UV map. So make sure that's in place as well.